Hey everyone, today we're going to finish up our Power App that we started last week. We're going to talk about resetting our controls, accessibility, we're going to talk about delegation, and if you should even use Power Apps to begin with. We're going to kind of go over all of that. And if you have more questions, leave them in the comments so I can put it in my video for next week. Today, we're going to finish out our form that we started last week. We are then going to go over resetting each one of the controls, and we're going to start changing the colors, add an image, and we'll talk about accessibility because once we start adding colors, we need to make sure that things are accessible and how to document that accessibility. Then we'll start talking about SharePoint integrated forms. I had a question from one of you for SharePoint integration. We'll discuss delegation. So let's get into it. Let's finish our form from last week. All right, so let's start where we ended last week. So last week we built this nice, beautiful form. It feeds a SharePoint list. Now I did rename the site collection. I just want to throw that in there. I renamed it because it was called list before. I thought that was confusing. So I called it site collection. We have our list here in SharePoint. Now I want to insert a new line item. So new line, and we'll have an email in here, and a status, test, and a date. And let's submit this to SharePoint. Now, when you notice is that the form didn't reset. And when we use the out-of-the-box forms, we can set it between new form and edit form. But when we're doing custom forms, we have to do all this manually. We need to set each control back to the original default that it was before. And that gets into one more of a tip. So let's say we did reset something. Let's insert a button. So this button is going to reset the proposal form, right? So when it resets, it does not reset it back to blank. It resets it back to the value that was set at. So it was set as this default. So this is the default value that it was set at. So I can write something in here, and I configure my button to reset my text proposal. It then resets it back to the default. It does not reset it back to blank. It resets it back to default. So that's just another little tip. So let's just take a look at SharePoint. We wrote a new line item in there, right? But I want to reset everything. And to reset everything, I'm just going to keep this super simple, right? I'm keeping it as simple as I can. I'm not adding complexity into this yet. But we're going to reset, and I know each one of my fields. I have text proposal, semicolon, reset the text email, reset the dropdown status, reset the text description, and reset the date time. Now this is just the simple way to do it. If you have a larger form, Power Apps is going to go in order, right? It's going to go chronologically. First, it's going to patch. Then it's going to reset text proposal. Then it's going to reset text email, and so on down the line. And this can take time. And in order to kind of make it run faster and smoother, I'm going to use the concurrent FX formula to run all of these resets in parallel. So I'm going to switch my semicolons to commas. So all of these are now going to run concurrently. And this matters more when you have larger forms. With our small form, it's not going to matter as much, but that's the correct way to do it, is to use concurrent. So now when I hit a new line item, boom, concurrently, they all disappear. And then we can check out SharePoint and refresh, and we can see we have that line item in there twice now. So that's good, that's good. That's what we want. Now it resets everything. I use the concurrent property. That's the first thing we were gonna do. The next thing I wanna do is, I wanna add a little bit of color in here, and we'll talk about accessibility after that. The first thing is, 3 years ago, I had a video about gradients. Within those 3 years, I've come to some conclusions, and I have my formula here for my gradients, and I've made some changes to this formula. But I'm just going to copy this one here out of this video. So 3 years ago, there was a way we did it. And today, what I'm going to do is on my screen, I'm going to insert an HTML text. And this HTML text is going to take up the entire screen. We want to make sure that it's responsive. So width is going to be parent.width. And height is going to be parent.height. But for our HTML here, in the HTML text, I am going to paste in my gradient. And so back then I used like a padding to make things bigger. I've learned some things. So I'm going to take out the padding, font size, color. Center I'm not going to use. There's a new property I like to use, and that is position. Position absolute. So absolute. So I like to add that in there. And now for the size, what I do is I add in the width. And then I say, okay, give me ampersand to give me back into equation, like pull the information from Power Apps. Do self.width. And then I'm going to do another ampersand. PX for pixels, and then we're going to type in the height, and the height is also going to be and self dot height, and then we'll add the PX at the end also here with an ending semicolon. Let's see, what are we missing? I'm also going to remove this box shadow. So let's see here. This single quote could go. There we go. So that single quote was blocking me. This is the simple formula I'm going to use for my HTML text. So position absolute, my gradient, this is my background gradient, and then the width and height are then inserted in here inside the div. Now, if you take a look, when we zoom in, there's a little bit of white space. So if you zoomed in right here, there's a little bit of white space. This is coming from the padding of the HTML. So down here, let me move me. This is coming from the padding of the HTML right here. So if we remove that padding, it then takes up the entire space. It's looking good. And then I'm going to send the HTML text to the back, send to the back. And I'm going to make this container. So first my header container, I'm going to make it slightly transparent. So for the color, I'm going to go to custom, probably 50%. Same thing for this container. I'm going to make the color custom, slightly 50%. And now because this is so dark, I'm going to lessen the gradient colors. It's a little too dark. So I'm going to get closer to a white. So white is 255 all the way. So I'm just going to add everything, to about 200 until we get to some white colors. And you can see that it is a little see-through in how that form looks. It looks pretty decent right now. I don't mind the way this looks right here. This looks pretty good. The fields here, actually, we can add a border to them. So we can click on this and we can add a border. So down here, we can add a border, a solid border. So now we have a nice border when we type. That looks better for me. That's my opinion. I like that border. Let's add an image in the background. Maybe you don't like doing the HTML linear gradient. So what we can do instead is here, let's add an image. So insert a media image. So we have an image, and once again, this image is going to take up all the space, and we're going to do the height and width. So that is parent.width and parent.height. All right, and then we're going to add an image into the image media property. So I have an image prepared. I made this with AI. You can do stock images or however you want to do it. All right, so I'm just going to upload that image in there. I like this image. It takes up the entire space. Instead of fit, I'm going to do fill, I believe. I want it to fill the space, so if it resizes. So now if it resizes, it fits in, fills in that space. I like the way that looks. So now I'm going to take my image and send it to the back. I'm going to send it all the way to the back. And then my linear gradient for my alpha values. So these are these ending ones here. I'm going to slowly let it become less transparent. So I'm going to start off with 0.5, 0.2, and then a 0.1. So it slowly turns more transparent. We have our form in here. This is looking good. I probably will darken the top part here. Maybe this color of this container will become like a dark blue maybe. And our icon will be a white. So it kind of looks like that. I think that's looking a little better. I like the way that looks. This is opinion. These are things you can figure out. I feel like email is unnecessary. And let me tell you why email is unnecessary. When we save, in our save button, instead of writing text.email.value, let's call user.email. Now notice in there you have look at the IntelliSense. There's .email, enter object ID, full name, and image. I'm going to do email. Whoever is logged in will then fill out, it will save that property. So I'm going to delete email actually. Delete it, and I'm going to remove it from my formula. Here, it's not going to reset. So now when I write something in and we click save and we go to SharePoint, you'll see that my email is then populated in the form right here. So you can see my email was automatically populated. That's, one less thing the user has to do. So that's good. You could probably write like a welcome thing here or a title. So there you go. Now it says proposal. We could probably add some padding to get it over off the side there a little bit. So 10 or maybe 30. Kind of get it off that side so it's more centered in our screen. So we have a beautiful form. I think this is beautiful. This is my preference, how I do forms. This is a great way to do Power Apps, especially if you have a simple form. You could probably do this in 30 minutes to an hour, but that doesn't mean a Power App takes 30 minutes to an hour to do. We'll get into that a little bit later. Let's talk about accessibility. First, let's talk about colors. Now, some people struggle between seeing different colors, right? Maybe if this was like a blue on a blue, like a light blue on a light blue, you might not be able to see it. I want to go over how I use Microsoft tools to go over accessibility. And to do that, I use the Fluent UI accessibility. I'll put the URL in the description of the video. But this is out of the box Microsoft. This is something they give us to help develop. And it's called the Fluent UI Theme Designer, right? And so if you choose colors, let's say we have a background color of like a dark blue, maybe a little bit darker blue. You can see how hard it is to see things. The text color, we can see that, we have a white and a blue, but it still says that we have still some accessibility errors. The options, when you show an option, it doesn't like show well. So you can kind of lower that to like an icy blue. And I'm sure there's a point right there. You see that? Right there, it said, okay, that's it, as close to blue we're going to let you. You need to go back to a closer white. So this is a good way I check my accessibility with my colors, right? Because if I want to verify in my documentation to say this is accessible, some projects will say make sure your app is accessible. I will put the information in the Fluent Designer, print it out and say this is accessible with these 3 colors, because that's sometimes what I like to do. All right, so we have our form. Next, with accessibility, when you come up here, you see this app checker. This app checker is going to say, hey, there's some accessibility issues. And these accessibility issues are missing the accessible label. If we click on icon, you see up here now on the top left, accessible label. And let's look at that a little bit more. If I open this up and I go to, I believe it's advanced, right here, accessible label. Hover over that. And if I zoom in, right, label readout by screen readers. People who may have trouble seeing, maybe there are some people who use screen readers. Maybe you want to say, okay, this is the save button. That is the save button. And you kind of work out your accessibility of each one of these. In a production app, I would say yes, drop down for status. You should fill out each of these. I would do it if you're doing this for a client. Multi line for description. You should fill out these. That's just my opinion. Date for proposal. All right, and then you could do a recheck and clear those out. Now your app is accessible that way. Another thing that you want to be aware of is if you are using non-modern, what's important is the tab order. As you press the tab key on your keyboard, right? You want it to go through the order of the app. You don't want it to skip around, right? And so that becomes more and more important when you're not using modern. If we go to the classic, let's say text, and we have a couple classic labels in here. They might need to be text, but we'll see in here. And we check this out in the advanced properties. Somewhere in here, there is a tab index. There it is right there. So this specifies the order of when you press your tab button, like the order. If I change this to 1, right, this would be first, and then 2, that would be second. That kind of, it's like through your order of your tab index. That's important too. You want to think about your tab index. That's another thing about accessibility. Not just colors, not just the way things look, you know, making it easy to read. That's kind of another thing you want to think about with accessibility. I'll probably bold these. I feel like they should be bold. Let's just go ahead and bold these out. Font weight, we'll do semi-bold. These should be semi-bold. Okay. I think we're looking pretty good. We've gone through accessibility, right? The next thing I want to talk about is, and this kind of comes from one of your questions. I wanted to go over this question right here. I wanted to go over this question by Bambazilla. I like the name, Bambazilla. And he wanted to know if it's important, you know, if you use custom form and how it's different if you're going to use integrate Power Apps and customize with SharePoint. This is leading me to my question. So let me just kind of go through my opinions. This is where opinion comes in. You may have a different one. Leave it in the comment. Let me know. I don't mind if you have an opinion. Time for opinions. Now, when you are creating a Power App, when you are gathering requirements, first question that I always ask myself, should this be Power Apps? And after I think about should this be Power Apps, I think about should this be a Microsoft form? I can create a Microsoft form really fast. It can have conditional branching. It can have, you know, other ways to fill out the information. A form is also external. Microsoft form can also be shared externally. Then I go to, should this be a SharePoint list? That's what I'm thinking. Okay, maybe this is just a SharePoint list. Why make a Power App? Why am I doing a Power App? I can do a lot in SharePoint. I can really customize a SharePoint list with some beautiful JSON. I can change the way SharePoint looks like crazy. I can make SharePoint beautiful. A lot of people don't realize how beautiful you can make SharePoint. A lot of people reject SharePoint because it's all the same. It all looks the same. It's not as beautiful. But you can make SharePoint look good without Power Apps. So that's after forms. So forms, should it be SharePoint? Then the next one is what the Bamba was asking about. A SharePoint integrated form. And let me show you that. Let's talk about SharePoint integrated forms. I'm not going to go through a full tutorial about this, but I want to highlight some main things. So first off, in SharePoint, this is your out-of-the-box form. This comes with SharePoint. It looks like this. You can make an integrated Power App right here. So integrate Power Apps, customize forms. Now this is quick, something you can do really fast. So you can come in here to Power Apps and you can customize your form so it overlays SharePoint. The question is do you want people to be able to see that backend data? Do you want people to see the rows in SharePoint? Maybe not. Maybe that's why you do Power Apps. You don't want people to see that. Maybe there's like a relation with your SharePoint form. Maybe you don't want to use lookup. There's lots of reasons you could use Power Apps instead. But so this is the out-of-the-box form. And there are things we can do, right? So we can come in here, we can change this. So instead of a value, we can say this is rich text editor. So we can unlock it, change this to a rich text editor. We can, kind of give it a width of parent dot width, minus 20 maybe. And the X value is 10, kind of fit it in there correctly. The height is then, I don't know, 250. Give it some more space in there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the data card value 4, which is what it was using before. And for these red X's, I'm just going to say this is rich text editor 1. Actually, HTML text, not text. And then I'm going to take the rich text editor 1 part and I'm going to fill out these X and Y values here just to get rid of that red X. So now we've replaced, so now we made a custom form, right? We wanted that multi-line text to have our rich text editor. We made a custom form in Power Apps integrated. Now the other thing, I'm not going to go a full video about this, that's very important and very different, is this SharePoint integration control property. I'm not sure what the right terminology is, but this right here is SharePoint integration. And watch what happens when I add a text label. So let's say I add a text label here at the top. I can call upon SharePoint integration and then use the IntelliSense dot what? Selected in title. So this is one way you can do like default properties. So a lot of people get confused. How do I do a default property in SharePoint integration? You use this SharePoint integration in your FX formula, call upon that, and you'll see after we publish this, the title will also be up here. So now let's publish this and replace our SharePoint out of the box form. This probably takes 30 seconds to a minute for it to publish. And so we'll just wait a little bit, give it a refresh, add new, and now you can see Power Apps has overlaid, taken up our space. Looks like the description did not come through. Maybe it didn't publish all the way yet. There it is. So it kind of took 30 seconds to a minute. We now have our title, our proposal description. It's now a rich text property. But watch this. Now, when I edit a line item, you see that? Using that SharePoint integration in our FX formula, I was able to set up a default of our form for which one we edit. There's other little properties in there. SharePoint integration right here. Check this out. On edit, do what? On new, do what? On save. So on save, you just submit form. Maybe you want to do something else. Maybe you want to patch a separate form. So you could add another patch in here, right? And then write to another form. That's another option, right? There's lots of little things in here on view, on new. Maybe you want these to look different. Maybe you want different colors if it's new, if it's edit, if it's save. Maybe if there's an error, you turn it red. So just remember there's some extra little properties on the SharePoint integration. Okay, and then finally, if you don't like your form and you want to go back to out of the box, list settings, form settings. Right here, you're using the custom form created by Power Apps, right? You can go back to use the default form. And then if you're done with that old form, delete it. Trust me, your Power Apps administrator, Power Platform administrator would appreciate that you delete this old custom form if you're not using it. Okay, now that we've decided as a team after gathering requirements, right? I don't just go in there and say, this is a Power App. No. Don't do that. Gather requirements. This is a form, SharePoint integration. Then you have Power Apps with a SharePoint backend. That's what we were learning today. Then you have a next step that a lot of people disagree with, but I really like, and that is Dataverse for Teams. So I love having Power Apps in Teams, and it uses Dataverse for the backend. And we can go into that. If you wanted to learn more about Dataverse for Teams, there's almost no documentation on Dataverse for Teams. People are so biased. People are very biased about using Dataverse for Teams. That's another topic. But it's an option. Dataverse for Teams, you can have a beautiful Power App, and you can stay in the out-of-the-box license model for Power Apps without going premium. Next, if you have delegation issues, if you have rows reaching, this is opinion, 10,000, 20,000 rows, maybe it's time to think about going to Dataverse or SQL. That's when you start thinking about Dataverse or SQL. There are options, so let's talk about delegation. There are options if you want to search SharePoint to use Power Automate and a REST call, a REST API call to search your SharePoint if it gets over 2,000 rows. So let's take a look at that also. So right here in Power Apps, if you go to settings and you scroll down, you'll see there is a data row limit. And so if you have non-delegable, that's hard. It's always hard for me to say. Formulas in your app, and usually it's like a yellow squiggly, then you can go up to 2,000 rows and pull 2,000 rows. That's where issues happen with SharePoint. You can look up delegation more if you want. There are ways around this. One, like I said, Power Automate. Power Automate's very useful. You can use REST to query your SharePoint list. You can use it to search. You can use it to write. You can use it to delete your SharePoint list. That's another option. Another option is instead of using search, right? So in here, people may use search, and this is non-delegable with SharePoint. What you can do instead is use starts with. So starts with is delegable. This is a good function to use for SharePoint instead. There are other options like filtering your data sources before you use them in equations, like only show the last 2,000 items, right? You can do that. When you first start up your Power app, you only pull 2,000 items, or you only pull 4,000. 4,000 is another good one. So you create one collection with another collection. 4,000 rows is all you pull into your Power app. That's another option. Then after you've exhausted all of your options and you just can't do it, many people are biased and they think Dataverse is better than SharePoint. And I come from a professional pro code background. I did JavaScript, React, C#. That's how I did apps before. And when you start getting into this Dataverse realm, that's where I start thinking, should this be full custom or not? There is model-driven apps. Model-driven apps are beautiful. They can be done very quickly, very fast. But as soon as you start having tons and tons of people on Power Apps Premium, it can be very costly. And that's where you have to weigh, should you have pro code developers or should you do low code developers with lots of licenses, right? So you have pro code developers who have a large salary, right? You may have a whole team with a large salary, or you have Power Apps Premium with a large cost also. So you have to weigh those two options. Another option is some people actually archive data out of SharePoint. I've seen this yearly. Their SharePoint list becomes large, so they archive it to SQL, or they archive it to Dataverse, or they archive the data to another SharePoint list. So that's another option. And then to query it, you just use Power BI on your new data and your old data, and you can create a union of the data as long as the columns are the same. So those are all options, and that's where delegation, there could be a whole video about this. That's just me giving you my 5 minutes opinions of delegation. All right, so this was another question that I have, and to me, this is either a table or a gallery. This is next week. I'm sorry, you're gonna have to wait. This is a long topic that we can talk about. Should we use tables? Should we use galleries? But the question is, hi mate, I wanted to see all the data after you click upload and get it shown on another screen. That is something I'm gonna go over next week. So next week, we'll go over galleries or tables, how you wanna do it. Keep it responsive, keep it looking good. So thank you all for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you have more questions, and I just got some more, if you have more questions, leave them in the comments. If you like and subscribe, ask a question. We can answer it in the next video. Thank you all for watching. My name is Andrew Hess, and I'll see you next week.